This is the Living Vernazzano podcast, brought to you by The Church at Riverstone, a fellowship of the Church of the Nazarene in Madera, California. We are a podcast that discusses the intersection of Scripture and our lives. Together, we continue the conversation that was started each preceding Sunday morning in our worship gathering.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick.
And I'm Natasha.
And we are the Living Vernazzano podcast. And here we are at the beginning of yet another season. This is now season 5 of the Living Vernazzano podcast. And, this is also the beginning of the season of Advent. So 2 beginnings today. For those of you who don't know, the season of Advent marks the beginning of the Christian calendar. And it consists of the 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas Day. Advent is a season of waiting, representative of the waiting that the Israelites experienced when waiting for the coming of the promised Messiah. And it's also indicative of the waiting we are all experiencing as we expectantly await Jesus' promised return. This year, as a church, we're using the material from the Foundry Publishing entitled Changed in the Waiting to guide our Advent weeks. Each week, there's a different reading and theme working towards the birth of Christ, the culmination of the first Advent. In our episode this week, our theme is hope, and we will be looking at a Psalm of David found in Psalm 25, verses 1 through 10. And Natasha will be reading for us today. So, Natasha, could you read Psalm 25, verses 1 through 10?
Yes. Psalm 25, verse 1. Of David. In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. I trust in you. Do not let me be put to shame, nor let my enemies triumph over me. No one who hopes in you will ever be put to shame, but shame will come on those who are treacherous without cause. Show me your ways, Lord. Teach me your paths. Guide me in your truth and teach me. For you are God, my Savior, and my hope is in you all day long. Remember, Lord, your great mercy and love, for they are from of old. Do not remember the sins of my youth and my rebellious ways. According to your love, remember me, for you, Lord, are good. Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore, he instructs sinners in his ways. He guides the humble in what is right and teaches them his way. All the ways of the Lord are loving and faithful toward those who keep the demands of his covenant.
All right. Thank you for reading that for us today, Natasha. Let's just jump into this conversation, whether it's a conversation of the theme of hope or as it relates to this passage or just things in this passage. I guess one of the first things that I think it would be important for us to bring out with the Psalms, obviously they were authored by somebody, and as you read at the beginning of your reading of the passage, you said of David. So we know that this is a Psalm of David. So he's the one who is credited with having written this. Also, oftentimes, Psalms were written in response to something or with something in mind, an experience, an event, something happening. And though this Psalm does not mention any specific historical event that is occurring, as I was kind of digging around in it, there are 2 primary thoughts of when David might have been writing this, which I think would help us or is helpful in understanding what he's talking about. And one of them is the thought that he penned this psalm when he was fleeing Saul. One of the times that Saul was pursuing him and he was running around through the wilderness, trying to evade him and Saul and his armies. The other thought is that this is being written perhaps during the rebellion of his son Absalom, who was trying to overthrow him, and he had to flee and eventually came back, but he was fleeing for his life because his son and his son's armies were trying to kill him and kind of overtake the throne. And so people believe it was one of these two times. I think that.
Do we get to weigh in on this?
You can go ahead.
Because my favorite is the second one, and I feel like it's the second one seems to resonate more with me. This fleeing during the time of Absalom, because he asks the Lord not to look at the sins of his youth.
Right.
And so I feel like when he's running from Saul,
he is a youth.
Yeah, he is a youth. There's not a whole lot of, we think of like, well, what comes to mind immediately for me is the story of Bathsheba.
Right.
And that whole situation, which I feel like that because that comes after his time of being pursued by Saul, then, I don't know. It just, for me, it fits better, I think, with the second version.
Yeah, no, and I think I would agree with that. It seems like the second option is more likely. Obviously, there was many times that enemy was coming in against Israel, and so there could be a myriad of other potentials as well. But these were kind of the top two, and I agree. I think the second one, when he is fleeing from his son, from Absalom, seems like a pretty good contextual starting point. And so I guess the reason why I say that's important is because as we read what David has to say, there's a lot about providing guidance. There's a lot about do not put me to shame. There's a lot about I hope in you. There's a lot about like, God, you are good. So like identifying who God is in the midst of this kind of rough situation. When we have a rough situation in mind, actually, it just becomes more real. Like, let's think about this. David being betrayed by his own flesh and blood, having to run for his life. So not only is his kingship being called into question, so like a political issue, but there's a familial issue at work as well, where his son no longer sees him as somebody to be respected and followed. And so there's just this crazy amount of turmoil that David is going through in the midst of fleeing his son and everything that goes with it. Family getting ripped apart, members of his family being killed during this time. Like, this seems like a pretty bleak, difficult, sad time in David's life. And even in the midst of this pretty rough time, this is what David is writing. This is what David is choosing to focus on. This is what David is emphasizing in the midst of this time of, I guess, in a way, waiting to find out what's going to happen. Is my son going to get me? Like, is he going to catch me and overthrow me? Am I going to have to, am I eventually going to come back and somehow result in my own son's death as I retake the throne that's rightfully mine? Like, he's in the midst of this tension of like, what is going to happen in the future? Also in the midst of all this pain of my family's just been torn apart.
I think that as you were speaking, you talked about the importance of leaning into the truths of who we know God to be, and which you pointed out, David does this really well in this psalm, and he highlights basically the characteristics of God that he knows to be true, and he knows can hold him and carry him through this time. And I feel like in the midst of a season of hope, oftentimes we find ourselves in these hard situations because it seems like we are more aware of the things we're hoping for when we see it contrasted against the things that are not yet or don't exist in the way that they ought to be. And so a lot of times those are seasons of lament or difficulty or mourning or sadness. And that's what accentuates the hope and makes it so good. And so hanging on to, in those seasons of difficulty, hanging on to those characteristics or those truths that we know about God, they're empowering. And I think that's probably why we spend time as a church each Sunday, each week, mentioning and sharing the characteristics that we know to be true of God. Because in these dark moments, in these difficult moments, those are some of the only things that we have to hold on to as true and real. And those things give birth to hope in the midst of suffering or difficulty or lament. And additionally, not only does David hang on to these truths about who God is in these moments of difficulty and lament, but he also, at the very beginning, he makes this declaration that in you, Lord my God, I put my trust. And I think maybe it's because we just came out of talking about Colossians that this kind of stands out to me. But we talked a lot in Colossians in the previous season about how there's this draw, and Paul in Colossians is addressing this draw
or temptation
toward having Jesus and
Right.
God and we talk so much about how Paul was really calling the church at Colossae to focus back on this idea of Jesus only.
Mm-hmm.
And here I feel like in David's psalm, he really he does that. He models that. He says, in you, Lord my God, I put my trust. And it's in God alone. There is nothing else. There's no other entities to whom he can turn. It's God only. And I think in that moment, he humbles himself. It's an attitude of humility and God, I don't have the answers for this.
Mm-hmm.
I am king of one of the most successful, kingdoms right now,
Experiencing peace and prosperity
and blessing, and yet still, God, I have. To whom can I turn? I can't turn to my advisors. They can't help me in this. I don't have family potentially at all to turn to right now, and everything else that I could potentially be tempted to turn to, I don't have it. But I instead put my full trust in you because I know that you have the answers and I know that you are good. And it's like in that moment, David's opening himself up once again to being poured into by God, to be being given enlightenment and answers and be transformed by God into whatever it is that he needs to be in this season and this time, whether that's to wait patiently in expectation of what God will do, or whether it's to listen for instruction as to what David should do to act as a conduit of God here on earth. And it's like he lays himself completely open for God's transformation in his life. And I think for us, when we sit in seasons of lament, those can often be the best seasons of transformation. Because we're vulnerable. We've come to the end of ourselves and we recognize God as he's the only option left. Unfortunately, sometimes it takes us going through several other options before we finally get to the place where we're like, okay, God, only you can fix this. Ideally, it would come a lot faster and he would be the first thing to which we'd turn and we'd say, oh God, I need your help. And I can't do this alone. And you've surrounded me with all these wonderful people, but we need your help. Ideally we'd land there first. But in that moment, we're opening ourselves up to God's transformative work in our lives by humbling ourselves, recognizing we don't have it and we need him and we need to rely on him. And it's in those moments, I think, that all of these characteristics that David mentions in this psalm, among others, God kind of begins to pour into our lives and helps those characteristics of himself that are so good and so perfect that we love so much to begin to be developed within us as his creation as well.
Yeah, I think something that you said early on is very important. And you said it a few different times, but you said David opens himself up to. And as I think about this psalm and the potential context that it's in the midst of, as I think about our own lives, as you brought up as well, when we are sitting in a time of lament and opening ourselves up to, the reason why David has hope or puts his trust in God, the reason why we can have hope in the midst of those laments is because we have this expectation that God will answer, that God will act. It doesn't mean that he immediately does act, right? Like there is, again, we're in this season of Advent, which is about waiting. And nowhere in this psalm does David say, I trust in you, Lord, I put my trust. And then by the end of the 10th verse, you see the valid reason as to why David puts his trust in him, because all of a sudden he has his throne back. Like the answer is not given. The answer for the particular situation that he is in the midst of is not given. But there is this expectation that God is there, that God is working, and this trust that David has in him in the midst of this time of waiting to figure out what's going to happen, waiting to figure out if he's ever going to be restored to his throne, waiting to figure out if their family is ever going to come back together, waiting to figure out if he's just going to be executed by his son. Like he doesn't come out of that season of waiting in this psalm, but it doesn't change who he understands God to be, nor does it change his expectation in the midst of this time of waiting of who God is and how God will act or should act. He simply says, God, you are faithful. God, I know you guide. And so right now, I'm lost. I'm needing guidance. And so because I know you guide, I know you will guide the next step and the next step after that and the next step after that. And as I think about like us today, I think this is something that is, again, very important for us to always hold on to, that just because we say that we have like hope in what God is going to accomplish, or just because we make the same declaration that David does of God, in you I put my trust, it doesn't mean that, well, snap, everything's done. Now the reason why I'm in the midst of lament, or the reason why I'm in the midst of waiting, I no longer have to wait for, because the solution is here. Like waiting could still be a long time in coming. We may not get the answer ever, even. But that doesn't change who God is. And as we sit in those times, like you pointed out, Natasha, as we sit in those times and we lean into who God is in expectation, he pours into us and transforms us in that waiting. I think the other thing from a application conversation that stood out to me from what you were saying as well, Natasha, is at the outset, David identifies in the midst of his circumstance, whatever his circumstance is, that his focus is on God alone. It's not God and anything. It's just God. And I think that even though we've talked about this through Colossians, even though this was a conversation through Romans, even though we even had these conversations as we worked through Haggai and Malachi, like this has been a pretty consistent theme, I feel like, that we've been talking about, like where our focus is. Even though we've had these conversations, I feel like it is regularly something that we are faced with, a decision we are faced with in life. Like, am I going to choose to focus on God and put my trust in God alone in the midst of the circumstance that I am facing and encountering? Or am I going to grasp at anything and everything else as well as God in an effort to get an answer to the problem that I'm facing? And I think that, unfortunately, more oftentimes than not, we err on the side of Jesus, and where we are grasping for any other way to answer the problem that we are in, but then we in a way we sanctify it by saying, well, that's Jesus opening a door or Jesus providing for it. But really it's just us clamoring for our own provision. And at the same time, I don't want to excuse anything and say it's impossible that God or that Jesus is providing in the midst of that. But we need to be very careful as a people who are claiming to have a singularity of focus, a single focus on Jesus. We need to be very careful that we are not making excuses for our disobedience because we are uncomfortable in the waiting.
Yeah, it's almost like we don't want to wait for the fulfillment of, or God's version of the fulfillment of the culmination of all of our waiting. It's like we're looking for the nearest exit ramp, you know, in this journey of waiting, or this season of waiting, we're looking for the first place where we can get off, because certainly, like, God would not make us wait too long, right? And I think there's an element of our hope that sometimes can drive us in that, but unfortunately, when our hope is in the exit and not necessarily in Jesus, then we can miss Jesus's good and perfect plan for something that is, I don't know, less than maybe what he would have had for us if we would have been willing to wait on his timing. And it's hard because you're looking for his discernment in times where sometimes he seems silent, you know, and sometimes his activity seems limited, though we know it's not. We know he's busy at work and doing incredible things that, like you pointed out earlier, we may or we may not get an opportunity to ever even know about or celebrate. But we can trust that he's working because we know that's who he is, and that's true of his character.
Right. Yeah. I feel like this kind of plays into a conversation that we had on last Tuesday as we prepared for this conversation on Sunday. And the words trust and hope were brought up, and the conversation was like, what's the difference? They seem very similar. Is there a difference? And in the work that we had done on that, we had identified that trust is a present confidence in God's character. It's an immediate act of reliance, while hope emphasizes an expectation. It's forward-looking, it's faith. It's essentially, hope is a result of the trust that we have in who God is, right? Hope is something that's far off. Trust is something that is present. And I feel like as we talk about what you were just talking about, Natasha, and this, you know, the difficulty that we often have in the waiting, I feel like the difficulty that we have in the waiting is a direct result of a misplaced trust. Because when we are trying to take the first exit in the midst of our difficulty that we are experiencing, rather than placing our trust firmly in God, as David does right at the beginning, in you, Lord, my God, I put my trust. In a way, we're saying, in me, Lord, I put my trust. Like, I do trust you, but I think I trust myself a little more because I don't know that I can trust you to take care of this specific situation. And so I'm going to provide.
Or at least I don't know that I can trust you to take care of this specific situation in the way that I want you to take care of this specific situation.
Right. And so I think, again, these two words are very important. David says both of them in this psalm, and I think they are very important. There's a nuanced difference. They seem like they're so similar, but when we can actually say our trust is in God and in God alone, then our hope is a completely different hope.
It's hope becomes true hope as opposed to being more of a wish. Right. We talked about the difference between what is a wish and what is a hope with the kids. And it was like they seem to get that a wish is something that you want to happen. A hope is something you know will happen. You're just not sure when.
That's good.
I thought, like, from the mouths of, you know, the 5 and 6 year olds, like this is some good theology stuff. So
yeah. And I feel like this is where our conversation on Psalm 25 and our conversation on the theme of hope really needs to kind of focus in on. As you work through Psalm 25, you have this declaration at the beginning of David saying, in you, Lord, I put my trust. I trust in you. Like verse 2, restating, I trust in you. Verse 3, talking about hope, So he talks about the trust, he talks about hope. But then as you go further down and you see what that looks like played out, it's this expectation of God's guidance. It's this expectation of God leading his paths, which we did talk about earlier. But when we think about this idea of hope in the waiting, when we think about this idea of what trust looks like, David can proclaim trust in God alone because he trusts that God is a good guide. In the middle of this chaotic situation that he is facing where it doesn't look like anything good could possibly come of it, he believes in the character of God enough, not in his own character, because he even admits his shortfalls.
Don't look at the sins of my youth.
Yeah, don't look at the sin. He admits the shortfalls of his own character, but he trusts in the character of God, the good guide. And I think for us today, like, this is what we need to hear. This is what we need to focus on. It is so easy for us to hear these words like hope, to hear these words like trust, to acknowledge like God's good guidance or whatever we want to say these things, but for them to be kind of void of the full meaning because we have heard them for so long. We have used things like, I trust you. We have used things like, oh, I hope that happens. We have used things like God is guide. And we have said them for so long, I think that they can be vacated of their full meaning. And so I feel like today we need to be reminded and restored to a full understanding of literally what it means to proclaim trust in Christ. When we say, Jesus, we trust in you, it means Jesus and nothing else. It means I'm not trying to figure out my own way out of this circumstance that I am in the midst of. It means that I genuinely am trusting you and I am expecting, Jesus, that you are going to guide me through this. Like it's not a misplaced, like I'm going to put my head in the sand and just wait for everything to blow over. But it's this expectation that God is going to guide in the midst of it. And we need to hear that today. Because I feel like as a church, as a people, as disciples of Jesus, we have gotten ourselves into the weeds. We have found ourselves off of many different paths because we make the statement like we trust in Jesus alone, but then we are depending on our own ways a lot. And so, Jesus, would you restore within us the fullness of what it means when we proclaim that we trust in you? Like, we know you to be guide. You made promises throughout Scripture in the Gospels that you will guide. The parting words to your disciples as you were ascending into heaven was, I will be with you always. Y'all, that is a promise that we can hear from Jesus, that we can hold on to, that we can trust in. Like he is revealing himself as trustworthy because he is with us always. And so as we are sitting in this second season, long season of Advent, while we are waiting for his return, as he's, ushering in his kingdom in full, we can trust in the reality that he is with us always. And regardless of the circumstances that we are facing, he is, in fact, guiding us. Like you were saying, Natasha, even though we may not see it, even though we may not understand it, he is there and he is guiding. And because of that, we can have hope in this time of waiting.
As you journey with us this Advent season, we recommend purchasing Changed in the Waiting, an Advent devotional, which is available for purchase on both Amazon and the Foundry Publishing website. Also, be sure to follow the Living Vertizontal podcast to stay current on all our new releases. To learn more about the Church at Riverstone, visit us at thechurchatriverstone.org.